Morning, I'm Stewart Brand. Bit of full disclosure, I've done more than usual research with the interviewee because we've been married for 24 years. And with any luck, if this goes well today, we'll stay married.
That's right.
Partly because of that, Ryan would like to have the lights up enough so that it's easy for you guys to feel like you can ask questions at any point in the course of this half hour. And also, she's going to be asking you some questions.
Perfect. That's great. Much more visible.
Yeah, it's nice to get out of that twilight we were in. About 2 years ago, I was at a conference sort of like this called BioAgenda. And a kind of radical medical futurist named Gregory Stock was on a panel about the future of healthcare. And to sort of tease his fellow panelists, he said, look, someday, gosh, maybe within the next 10 years, there'll be a place online where you can go and get your genes tested directly, right for yourself. So you can find out what kind of susceptibilities, what kind of diseases you have. And you'll know that just as soon and with as much privacy as you want. Now, legally, it may have to be on the moon or something like that, but it's coming. It could be in the next 10 years. So I staggered up to the microphone and said, well, as it happens, my wife runs a business that does exactly that. It's been online for, at that point, a few months. And DNAdirect.com, if you guys with laptops want to check it out. And she's not on the moon, she's in California. So that's the sort of thing us futurists are always finding, is about the time that you can say this is going to happen sometime in the next 10 years. If you look closely, it's probably already happening. So my question to you, Ryan, is what is it that's actually already happening? What are you doing?
So first of all, we're not the lab. And I think today, in the last few days, both with Randy's talk and with other companies presented here, you've heard a lot about where the science is going around genomics. And DNA Direct is really downstream from that. We really try to help people get access to tests that are medically, clinically valid. So we're pretty conservative in what we bring to market, so to speak. We're really trying to not get ahead of the science and try to help make sure that when people do get tested, that they're really finding out information that's useful to them, that, as we say, is actionable, that it will make a difference in their lives.
Like what kind of stuff?
So I think typically when people think about genetic testing, they think about very rare medical genetic conditions. We look at tests that help people think about an inherited risk for or predisposition to a disease. And I think kind of the classic one is breast and ovarian cancer testing. Somewhere between 5 to 10% of breast cancer may have an inherited factor or predisposition. And the way that our company works is we help facilitate that test. We're basically the medical physician of record. We provide anonymity for this service so that people can test with privacy and confidentiality.
Why would they want that?
Well, one of the big issues for a lot of people is a question of what's going to happen with their genetic information. And fear of reprisal from employers, from insurance companies where they may get a claim declined. And we can talk about that later today if you want, about a little bit about some of the legislation that's going through right now in that regard. But I think it's safe to say that today the question of privacy is of significance to the consumer. And so our company provides a unique identifier. We provide a cheek swab kit or facilitate a blood draw. They do it from their home. They send it off to the lab. And then the lab sends us back the one-page report, which is all people really get when they get a genetic test, which says a deleterious mutation was found or not. It looks very scientific, this document. It's a lab result that even physicians look at and many times are perplexed on how to actually interpret it to the consumer. So then what happens is our genetic experts, our genetic counselors, put together an actual report, a 20 to 50 page report on the web that allows the consumer now to go in and look at their actual lab result if they want, but also sort of their genes in context, what it actually means. How did this happen to me? What does it mean to other family members? How do I look at this relative risk or residual risk? What kind of actions can I take? What kind of surgical or therapeutic interventions, lifestyle, and really where the science is on this today.
Can you give an example of what you mean by actionable? What kind of action you can take?
Well, for example, we had, I'm thinking about an unusual situation, and it will touch more of the men in this room. One of our very first callers for breast and ovarian cancer testing was a 77-year-old male. And that really surprised us, but it wasn't the first time that we had an elderly male actually respond with an interest in testing. And his personal story was his mother had died of breast cancer, and his now 40-year-old daughter had just presented with ovarian cancer. And he was left, having looked at the literature and thinking, well, gosh, am I the vector here? Is there a correlation? And he called and wanted privacy and anonymity, and we provided the testing, and in fact, he was carrying the BRCA gene. And he himself was at risk for breast cancer, poorly known that men do get breast cancer as well, but also he himself was at much higher risk for prostate cancer, carrying that gene. Now, the reason he wanted to test was because he had an extended family, and as he said, before I leave this planet, I want to make sure that any knowledge about my family history and my family predisposition can be passed on to future generations. So now the question is, what does that young woman do and those family members do? Well, there's a lot they can do. One, they can do much more vigilant screening. Ovarian cancer is incredibly deadly and usually caught at a very late stage. And the value of testing for that person can help them make lifestyle decisions, to have children earlier than later, to have prophylactic mastectomies, and to even go on some therapeutic interventions.
So, okay, breast cancer, what else do you guys cover?
Well, before I answer that question, I'm going to put one to the audience, because I'd love to get a little more engagement here. If I told you what kind of tests that we offer, before I told you that, you'd probably think again that they're mostly rare genetic conditions. So I'm going to ask it in a different way. And I'm going to ask you, and without divulging any medical privacy here, whether you or someone in your family has ever had an experience with
any of the following.
Yeah.
It'll be aggregate, I assume.
Type 2 diabetes, asthma, breast, ovarian, or lung cancer, colon cancer, iron overload disease, infertility, cystic fibrosis, and that's a pretty good list. So have you or anyone in your family ever been impacted by that condition? Raise your hand. Now that's just the beginning of where testing, that's just what my company offers now. Now, again, that's just for a predisposition to it. In some cases, it's diagnostic. Certainly testing that we do for cystic fibrosis testing, testing for underlying causes of infertility, hemochromatosis, iron overload disorder, these are actually diagnostic. And in some, like type 2 diabetes, it's just for a predisposition that would indicate someone's at twofold risk. The other area of testing, I'm going to ask you another question, is around drug metabolism. And 40% of the most commonly prescribed drugs today are known to be metabolized through this P450 enzyme, a family of genes that actually, help with the metabolism of these particular medications. That's a huge number, 40%. And adverse drug reactions hospitalize people every day. It causes something like 200,000 deaths a year. It's one of the leading causes, for medical visits today. So I'm going to ask you a question. Have you ever experienced, or someone in your family, a situation where you felt that you weren't getting any therapeutic benefit from a drug, or you were getting too much to get an adverse drug reaction? How many have experienced that? Someone in their family? Not as many as I would have expected.
You may not actually know. That's one of the reasons to do this stuff.
Well, it's interesting, and I'll tell you a little bit about a story of, and it actually was a friend of ours who tested. She's had chronic medical condition for years with a very extensive pain, and she'd gone through all kinds of therapeutic interventions. She'd never gotten the normal doses of pain relief. Has a very strange parasite that she picked up at traveling, and it's a terrible story. But the bottom line was, when I realized we started doing this drug metabolism testing, I asked our friend Isabella whether or not she would like to get tested with us and to help us sort of learn about the experience of what testing might be like for her, something we do all the time. She took the test, and it turns out she is a classic, quote, poor metabolizer. She's carrying 2 copies of this P450. It's actually the 2D6 gene. And it basically means that she cannot metabolize, ever will not metabolize a long list of drugs, all of which she was taking. And it also meant that she was at much higher risk for adverse drug reactions from those drugs. And those were antidepressants and pain interventions.
So how about the tamoxifen story? That's another version of that, it seems like.
Yeah, so the way I got into the drug metabolism testing, I follow the literature on the science of where I think genetic testing can be most useful to the consumer. And one came to my attention that really just sort of galled me. And that was around a drug called tamoxifen. And women who have had breast cancer most frequently go on tamoxifen as what they refer to as an adjuvant therapy to avoid a recurrence after they've had surgery. And it turns out there's something like 500,000 women in the US today on tamoxifen. It's been on the market for close to 20 years. It's still the most commonly prescribed drug. And tamoxifen is metabolized through the same pathway. And the correlation between 2D6 and tamoxifen is now very well documented. In the Caucasian population, 10% of people will be poor metabolizers, just by genotype. And what we know is what that means is that close to 50,000 women today are taking tamoxifen, and they're basically taking a placebo.
With lots of nasty side effects.
Potentially lots of nasty side effects, because there's no correlation between efficacy
and a considerable expense.
Well, considerable expense, and most importantly, they're on it for 3 to 5 years. Mm-hmm. And they believe they're getting, a prevention for, life-threatening situation. So it's really serious. The FDA looked at this situation last October, and I went and spoke before the FDA. And I was the only sort of consumer group present at this very scientific meeting. There were a dozen panelists, all pharmacogeneticists, looking at the literature. And they were kind of hemming and hawing a little bit about, well, maybe we need one more clinical trial, and what about premenopausal women versus postmenopausal, and a lot of nuance I won't mention. And I got up and I said, if there were a line of breast cancer patients behind me, you would not be able to sit here and hem and haw like this, because a lot of women are basically taking a placebo. And it totally changed the vote. That and a lot of discussion. I'm not really trying to take credit, but it helped elevate the fact that we're really talking about people here. We're not just talking about studies. And the FDA panel at the end of that meeting, at the end of the day, voted unanimously to relabel the drug tamoxifen to indicate that there is this genotype-phenotype correlation, and that physicians need to be more aware of it when they're prescribing the drug.
Okay, physicians, are they as aware as they should be of all this? I mean, what I hear from bioethicists is this direct-to-the-consumer thing is dangerous. People will hear about some kind of condition they have, they'll go out and commit suicide, you'll be liable. But if it happens in a doctor's office, it's okay, and that's what bioethicists seem to convince the government should be the law.
It's true, and there's a lot of, I think, a lot of people opine upon whether or not consumers should have access to genetic testing. And the number one issue that comes up is, can they handle the information? Will they misinterpret the information? Will they believe that it's deterministic? Will they believe that this means I'm going to get type 2 diabetes, or does it mean I'm going to get breast cancer tomorrow? And take it out of context. Well, you know, I've been in healthcare now for 25 years trying to help people get better educated around healthcare issues. And what I know is that consumers are not as dumb as people think they are. And I also know that there's an appropriate way to provide information. So the company that I created, again, you know, we help with the test. We're not the lab. We don't make money on the test. Our sole service is in providing information to help people put this in context, to let them know when it's appropriate to test, to help them make a decision of whether or not testing is appropriate, to avoid preying on the vulnerable public that, you know, might think this is, you know, a panacea. And, you know, usually the media always ask me, well, this has just got to be a perfect company for the worried well. You know, this is just, you know, got to be the perfect thing. And I said, you know, it's just really not that. This is about the rightly worried. You know, the people who test with us actually have a good reason. Either, just like you raised your hands, either have a personal reason that these conditions have touched them, or they have a family history that's really relevant. And one of the ways we know that, interestingly enough, is by looking at our mutation rate, the number of positive mutations. And if you were to go to a genetic center anywhere in the world, the actual amount of people who test positive are somewhere between 5 to maybe 7% have a positive mutation. At DNA Direct, our positive mutation rate from the day we started just 2.5 years ago has always been somewhere between 35 and 40%.
Remember, you're welcome to stand up and ask
I'd love to hear some questions from the audience.
Any point here.
You got one.
Oh, great. Go for it.
Charles Eldering with TPL and Expanse Bioinformatics. And it seems like you've very quickly focused in on genes that are clearly linked to diseases, and you're providing a service, and that's fantastic. Have you considered the amount of epigenetic information or also behavioral situational data in areas where there's not causality but statistical association, and will you be able to start to bring that data in, or do you see other entities starting to fold in epigenetic and kind of the whole life data?
I don't know of any commercial product around epigenetics. I know that you know, our clinical staff looks at this research, and we're trying to figure out, you know, how we can incorporate more information always in our reports to indicate that the environment, the lifestyle, it always plays a factor in all of these conditions that we're testing for. But again, we're not the lab. We follow the science, and you know, part of the areas that, you know, we want to grow the company, I think will really be working with the laboratories that are doing everything from tumor profiling, like the Molecular Profiling Institute, Genomic Health, where companies are looking at analyzing a tumor and trying to figure out whether or not a treatment can work. If there was something in that area in epigenetics, and if you know about it, you know, I'd certainly like to know.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, this gentleman's coming up. Let me ask about your business, because you know, Leroy Hood and people like that have been saying, well, this kind of really seriously personalized preventive medicine is going to come. It's going to be huge. He's been saying that for a while. And yet, as a company, you're pretty early in this field, and you're treading hard on the heels of the science. You're ahead of most of the doctors. So how does that work as a business?
It's tough. You know, we really are trying to grow a market. We're trying to grow educational awareness around testing. And we get a tremendous amount of interest in our site. A lot of people come to the site and learn a lot about our conditions, and then they go talk with their doctor, and then we lose them. And, you know, that's a challenge for us. So part of what we're trying to do is now work with the diagnostic manufacturers, the companies that are leading the way in this area, and trying to help them with a sort of a marketing strategy to find the consumer audience for this. You have a question? Yeah.
One follow-up on that. When you provide a report to the person who's got the results from their test, is there a version of that that they can give to their physician if they choose to do so?
Good question. So with all of our reports, number one, we want to make sure that people realize that knowing about your genetic situation, your predisposition, is really going to be helpful to your medical team. So we include in everything that we do on the web a 3 or 5 page letter for them to take to their doctor that says exactly what kind of tests they had. It's written in physician speak. It explains the scientific reference. It explains what the standard guidelines say about course of intervention. So it empowers the physician as well. And again, we've, in the report itself, we actually try to really help encourage people to do that.
Question here.
Yes, Jonathan Wilkie, Nikola Technologies. I think my wife will be your first customer. She's
Great.
an orphan who was born in East Berlin. She has no idea about her medical history, and it haunts her. How can she find out about her DNA?
Well, one step that someone like your wife might be interested in is finding out about her ancestry. And our company, because we're focused on medical genetics, is not yet offering that kind of broad consumer product. But ancestry testing would probably be of interest to her to find out really what is her ethnicity. Once she actually knew her ethnicity, there are certain conditions that are well-known associations. So Ashkenazi Jewish, people of Ashkenazi Jewish descent are very prone to certain conditions. You know, and you can work your way down the line and start to drill down on what kind of tests are available. We get calls all the time saying, is there a gene test that I can take, the one test that'll tell me everything? And it is just not there yet. I think there are companies that, you know, will certainly be emerging in this field. You may have seen an announcement of one being backed by Google that'll do ancestry someday, and will help people link up with people like them and help share health information. So I think it's such an exciting space. There's so much going on in terms of the connectivity around ancestry, and I think there's so much going on really that's clinically valid. But one thing in our remaining time that I'd like to do and pull out of my pocket is a product I'm thinking about bringing to market. And part of the reason I'm thinking about it is because there isn't this one gene test, but that my sense is that there's going to be. And what I'm trying to figure out is how many early adopters are there out there. So
We're a focus group. This is a market test.
Cleverly packed to avoid any moisture contamination. This is a very clinical product, and I've got to figure out if there's a consumer market. This is a DNA storage device. And interestingly enough, the company that developed this basically could, for a very small amount of money, and we can talk about the price on something like this, would purify DNA and allow an individual to store this in their home for safekeeping for future generations. And why would somebody want to do this? You know, when I first started the company, I looked at testing about the banking of DNA for future generations, and it was always about a frozen specimen, and you would send off a cheek swab or a blood test, a blood prick, and you'd send it off to someplace in the world and hope that they continue to keep their freezers running until the day that somebody wanted that. And you'd pay every month for that storage fee like they do for cord blood banking. That seemed way too non-consumer oriented to me, until I saw this technology just in the last 6 months. And I realized that, you know, we could do it this size. I mean, this is just happens to be a one that they use for reference labs. But it could be very simple, and you could have one for grandparents and one for yourself. And the reason I think that I would want to do it would be for future generations to see this correlation. We know right now that the example I gave you of that elderly gentleman with a family history of breast cancer, if he had already died, his daughter could have thought her ovarian cancer was just bad luck, which is what a lot of cancer is. But in fact, it wasn't. In fact, it was a genetic predisposition. But they needed his DNA to do that. And I think that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that family history is going to actually help us get better personalized medicine, help us get the better cancer treatment or whatever it is.
So what do you want these guys to tell you?
So in my 5 seconds, I'd love to know whether or not anyone here would be interested in, banking your DNA at home in safekeeping in multiple copies. You could have 5, one at your office, one in a safe deposit vault. And if I just asked for a show of hands.
Wait, how much does it cost? I mean, this thing is cute as a Tesla, but hopefully isn't as expensive.
Somewhere under $100.
$100?
Under $100.
$100 to store DNA in a
show
really
of hands.
way.
I see a couple coming up. All right.
Okay.
And would there be a lot more if it was $50? How many at 50? No, I really don't know what it'll cost, but I really appreciate that input.
Way
So
to
we'll
go.
see.
Service coming up. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.